A rolling suitcase. A pressed navy uniform. 4 gold stripes, catching the fluorescent light of an employee parking structure at 5 a.m. Officer Grant Halsey looked at the man walking toward the crew gate and saw not a captain, but a costume. He was about to learn, in the space of one very long morning, that pulling a real airline captain off his own flight is not a traffic stop. It is a federal aviation incident. And by the time the sun came up, the FBI would be standing in his precinct's lobby, asking why a scheduled international flight sat empty at the gate. Harlow County International Airport had spent the last decade rebranding itself as a rising regional hub, courting a mid-size international carrier called Meridian Atlantic Airlines to anchor a new transatlantic route, and building an entire marketing campaign around the promise of world-class security. That promise rested, in practice, on the Harlow County Airport Police Division, a small force of 40 officers who patrolled the terminals, the ramp, and the employee parking structures under a mandate that had grown in the years since a string of viral videos about impersonators sneaking past checkpoints, increasingly jumpy and increasingly discretionary. Nobody had written down exactly what looks like it doesn't belong here meant. Everybody on the force had their own definition. Officer Grant Halsey was 36 years old, 6 years into the job, and had spent most of those 6 years quietly convinced that Harlow County's real security threats looked nothing like the well-dressed businessman who breezed through the employee checkpoints every morning without a seconding glance from anyone. He had 2 citizen complaints in his file, both dismissed after cursory review, and a reputation among the newer hires for being the officer who actually took the impersonator briefings seriously, a description he wore privately, like a badge of honor. It was 5:05 on a Thursday morning in early spring. The sky still, the deep charcoal that comes an hour before dawn, when Halsey and his rookie partner, Officer Maya Chen, sat parked near the employee gate, outside Terminal C, watching the pre-dawn shift change shuffle through in a slow, sleepy procession of ramp agents, bagagehandlers, and flight crew rolling their bags toward the crew lounge. Halsey said, straightening in his seat, setting his coffee down carefully on the dash so it wouldn't spill, as a tall man in a crisp Navy captain's uniform came around the corner of the parking structure, rolling a black flight case behind him, 4 gold stripes on each shoulder, catching the sodium light. Officer Chen, 5 months into her first solo rotation, followed his gaze. That's a captain's uniform. Grant, 4 stripes. He's probably heading to the crew lounge for a briefing. I know what 4 stripes look like. Halsey said, I also know we had a guy in a fake TSA jacket try to walk straight onto the ramp last spring. Look at how he's moving. Doesn't have a lanyard out. Badge isn't visible. That's exactly the profile from the briefing. He's got a flight case and a uniform. Grant, most crew don't wear their badge outside the jacket until they're through the checkpoint. Then let's go make sure he's who he says he is. Halsey said, already reaching for the door handle, inside his uniform jacket, clipped to the inner pocket rather than the outer lapel, a habit from 20 years of early mornings. Keeping the badge from swinging and scratching the fabric, Captain Malcolm Reeves carried his Meridian Atlantic crew identification, his FAA airline transport pilot certificate, and his current medical certificate, all exactly where airline regulations required them to be. He was 47 years old, a senior captain with 19 years at Meridian Atlantic and 11,000 flight hours, walking toward the crew lounge to begin his pre-flight briefing for Meridian 224. A scheduled 6:40 a.m. departure to London Heathrow with 211 passengers already checking bags at the counter. 3 floors up, he did not see the cruiser's headlights sweep across the concrete pillars until they were already angled directly across his path. And by the time he stopped walking, Officer Halsey was out of the vehicle and closing the distance with the rolling, aggressive stride of a man who had already decided what he was looking at. "Stop right there," Halsey called out, one hand resting on his duty belt. Malcolm stopped. 19 years of commanding a flight deck had trained him to read a situation fast and completely threats. Exits. The state of the people around him, and what he read now was an agitated officer with his hand near his weapon and a rookie hanging back near the cruiser. Visibly unsure, he set his flight case down slowly and kept his hands visible. "Good afternoon, officer," Malcolm said. His voice carried the calm, even, unhurried cadence of a man who had talked 200 nervous passengers through rough turbulence without ever once raising his own pulse. "Is there a problem? What are you doing back here?" "Heading to the crew lounge for my pre-flight briefing. I'm the captain on Meridian 224. 6:40 to Heathrow. You got ID on you?" "I do. It's clipped inside my jacket. Not on the outside. I'm going to reach for it slowly. If that's all right." "Hold on," Halsey said, and something in his voice tilted from suspicion towards satisfaction, as though the very fact that the badge wasn't visible confirmed exactly what he had already decided, walking across the parking structure. "We've had impersonators try to walk crew gates before. Uniform. Rolling bag. Novisibile ID. That's the exact profile from the briefing. I understand the concern," Malcolm said, keeping his voice level despite the cold weight settling into his chest. "I am a Meridian Atlantic captain. My credentials are in my jacket. I'd be glad to show you. If you'll let me reach for them. Chief of the flight or whatever you want to call yourself," Halsey said, and the disbelief in his tone was not subtle. He looked Malcolm up and down the uniform. The flight case, the dark skin under the flat garage lighting, and made a decision that had nothing to do with anything actually said. "Turn around. Hands on the wall. Officer, I have a flight departing in 90 minutes with 200 passengers already at the gate," Malcolm said. "I want that on the record. I am complying. But there is no cause for this. Save it," Halsey said, and grabbed Malcolm's arm harder than the movement required, spinning him toward the concrete wall of the parking structure. He patted him down roughly, yanking the uniform jacket open, and found the leather credential wallet clipped to the inner pocket. He pulled it free and flipped it open. One-handed, the gold and blue Meridian Atlantic seal caught the sodium light. Beneath it, a photograph of Malcolm in the same uniform, and beside it, tucked into the same wallet, his FAA airline transport pilot certificate and current first-class medical certificate. Officer Chen, close enough to see it over Halsey's shoulder, felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Grant, that's a real ATP certificate. Look at the FAA seal. Anybody can laminate a card," Halsey said, though something in his certainty had already begun to fray. He closed the wallet and shoved it into his own jacket pocket rather than actually reading it through. "We're not taking chances. Cuff him." "I am not resisting," Malcolm said, loudly enough for Chen to hear clearly. "I am completely compliant. You are detaining a scheduled flight crew member with an aircraft waiting at the gate." The cuffs snapped shut, biting into wrists that, in 11,000 hours of flying, had never once been restrained by anything but a shoulder harness. Malcolm did not fight it. He understood, with the same clarity he brought to every emergency checklist, exactly what resisting would cost him against an agitated man with a hand near his weapon in an empty parking structure before dawn. "You are making a serious mistake, Officer Halsey," Malcolm said, reading the name tag as he was pulled upright. His voice did not rise. If anything, it dropped, taking on the same flat, procedural calm. He used reading back an emergency checklist, item by item. "I am asking you clearly to stop this before it becomes something that neither of us can undo. Tell it to the sergeant, Halsey said, and walked him toward the cruiser, the Harlow County Airport Police substation. Tucked into the lower level of the parking garage between the rental car counters and a shuttered coffee kiosk. Had the particular hush of a facility running on its overnight skeleton crew, a desk sergeant nursing bad coffee. A bank of monitors, half-watched. The low electric hum of fluorescent light. Sergeant Dale Whitfield looked up as Halsey walked a handcuffed man in a captain's uniform through the booking doors. And something about the scene made him set down his crossword before he'd finished the clue. What we got? Suspected impersonator. Employee gate. No visible ID at the point of contact, Halsey said, which left out the fact that the ID had, by that point, been sitting in his own jacket pocket for nearly 10 minutes. I am the captain of Meridian Flight 224. Departing in under an hour, Malcolm said, his voice carrying clearly across the small booking area. My identification is in that officer's pocket. I am requesting my one phone call. And I am requesting it now. Because every minute that passes delays a flight with over 200 passengers aboard. Whitfield glanced at Halsey, who shrugged and pulled the leather wallet from his jacket, tossing it onto the counter with a studied carelessness that didn't quite land. Whitfield picked it up, opened it, and actually read it this time, the FAA seal, the medical certificate, the Meridian Atlantic crew badge, and felt the particular prickle of unease that comes to a desk sergeant who has just realized the morning is about to get very complicated. You're actually flying this thing this morning. I was scheduled to... I imagine at this point, that flight is no longer on time. You'll get your call after processing, Whitfield said, not unkindly, and had Chen lead him back to a holding cell. What none of the three of them yet fully understood was that Meridian Atlantic's Operations Control Center in Charlotte had, 4 minutes earlier, flagged Flight 224 as a crew no-show when Malcolm failed to badge into the crew lounge for his scheduled briefing window, and that airline operations protocol for a captain who vanishes without explanation 90 minutes before an international departure did not involve waiting patiently to see what happened next. Malcolm sat on the cold metal bench in the holding cell, wrists throbbing, and did what 19 years of emergency procedures had trained into him. He catalogued badge numbers, timestamps, the precise sequence of what had been said and done, not out of fury, though the fury sat banked low beneath the discipline, but because he understood exactly how thin the line was between a story that got believed and one that got dismissed. 11 minutes later, Officer Chen appeared at the bars, glancing over her shoulder toward the front office. Captain Reeves, I called the Meridian crew scheduling line. You're listed. Senior Captain. 19 years with the airline. She hesitated. I don't understand why he kept going after he saw the credentials. What's your name? Officer Chen. Maya Chen. Officer Chen. I need my phone call. And I need it immediately. She walked to the front desk, without waiting to be told twice, retrieved the handset, and carried it back without a word to anyone. Malcolm did not call a lawyer, and he did not call his wife, though both calls would come later. He dialed the number every Meridian Atlantic captain carried memorized for exactly this kind of morning, the airline's Corporate Security Operations Center. Meridian Atlantic Corporate Security. This is Director Alvarez. This is Captain Malcolm Reeves. Employee number 40217. Scheduled on flight 224 this morning. I am currently detained in a holding cell at the Harlow County Airport Police substation. I was stopped at the employee gate. My credentials were seized and disregarded, and I have been placed under arrest. There was a silence on the line that lasted 2 full seconds too long. Captain, we flagged you as a no-show 6 minutes ago. Are you saying airport police pulled you off the ramp before you even reached the lounge? Affirmative. I need this escalated immediately, both through corporate security and through the FAA's Flight Standards District Office. Because this is no longer a personnel matter. It is an unlawful interference with a scheduled flight crew member. Sit tight. Captain, I'm activating our incident response protocol right now. And I'm looping in the FBI's aviation crimes coordinator directly. This kind of interference with a flight crew carries federal weight, and we are not treating it as a local matter. 22 miles away. At Meridian Atlantic's Regional Operations Hub. Director of Corporate Security, Renata Alvarez, a 19-year veteran of aviation security who had spent the bulk of her career investigating threats to flight crews, ranging from unruly passengers to actual hijacking plots, had exactly one gear for the words, "Airport police detained my captain," before departure. "Get the duty FAA liaison on the line," she told the analyst at the next desk, already reaching for her jacket, "and notify the FBI Field Office's Aviation Crimes Unit. We are treating this as an interference with flight crew incident, not an HR issue." Renata, that's a municipal holding cell. You want the FBI rolling on an airport substation. I want federal agents in that lobby within the hour. Alvarez said, a licensed airline captain, in uniform, with valid credentials in hand, was pulled off a scheduled international flight and arrested. That flight now has 211 passengers sitting at a gate with no crew. This is not a jurisdictional grey area. It is a federal aviation security incident. She called the FBI's on-call aviation crimes coordinator herself, laid out the situation in 4 flat sentences. And within 30 minutes, 2 unmarked federal vehicles and a Meridian corporate security response team had converged on Harlow County. Light bars cutting through the pre-dawn dark with the same unhurried, deliberate precision as a storm front rolling in. Back in the holding cell, Malcolm sat with his eyes closed, running through the same calm sequence he brought to every abnormal checklist, not anger, which accomplished nothing at 35,000 feet or in a concrete cell, but the precise architecture of what had happened and what it would cost the people responsible. Unlawful stop without articulable suspicion. Seizure of valid federal aviation credentials. Continued detention after the badge was in the arresting officer's own hands. Interference with a scheduled air carrier operation. He did not need to raise his voice. The paperwork would raise it for him. The commotion reached the substation before the agents did first, a runner from the terminal relaying that Meridian's gate agents were making increasingly frantic public announcements about a delayed departure, then the low rumble of vehicles pulling into the small lot outside, blocking every exit with the unhurried precision of people who had done this before. Federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI fanned out along the perimeter, without a raised voice among them. The substation's glass doors opened without anyone touching them first. And Special Agent Priya Anand, the aviation crimes coordinator, who had been 3 exits down the interstate, when the call came in, walked in first, flanked by a Meridian corporate security officer and an FAA enforcement investigator carrying a slim leather folio. "I am Special Agent Priya Anand, FBI Aviation Crimes Unit," she announced. And the words filled the small substation, the way a foghorn fills a harbor. "I am here for Captain Malcolm Reeves." Officer Halsey came out of the break room mid-sip of coffee, and the coffee stopped, mattering the moment he registered the windbreakers. The vehicles through the glass. The sheer fact of federal law enforcement standing in his substation before sunrise. "What is this?" he said, and it came out much smaller than he intended. Anand closed the distance in 5 unhurried steps. "Are you the officer who detained Captain Reeves? This was a legitimate stop. Impersonation profile. No visible ID at contact. He had his credentials on him. And you took them and put them in your own pocket rather than verify them." Anand said. "Where are they now?" Halsey's hand went, unthinking, to his jacket, where the leather wallet still sat. He said nothing, which was answer enough. "I saw the whole thing," said Officer Chen. stepping forward from near the filing cabinets. Arms crossed tight over her chest. He told Officer Halsey exactly where his ID was before there was ever contact. Halsey found it during the pat-down, saw what it said, and cuffed him anyway. I confirmed his employment with Meridian's crew scheduling desk before we even left the parking structure. Maya Halsey started. "No," she said, her voice cracking but holding. "I'm not covering for this. The FAA investigator, a precisi." Grey-suited man named Walter Osei opened his folio on the booking counter with the crisp finality of someone laying down documents that had already won the argument. "Officer Halsey, you unlawfully detained a licensed airline transport pilot with valid FAA credentials in your possession, and your actions directly caused the delay of a scheduled international flight carrying over 200 passengers. Unter Titel Nur. That is a matter of serious federal interest, regardless of what jurisdiction you believe you were standing in." Sergeant Whitfield was already moving down the short hallway with his keys. Not waiting to be told twice, the cell door screeched open, and there sat Captain Malcolm Reeves, wrists faintly bruised, uniform jacket still creased from the pat-down, sitting with a stillness that made the small concrete room feel, for a moment, like the calmest place in the building. Special Agent Anand stopped at the bars and allowed something like relief to cross her face for the first time that morning. "Captain Reeves, my apologies for the delay. Good to see federal agents in this room." "Agent Anand," Malcolm said, rising slowly, rolling one shoulder where the cuffs had pulled at the joint. "I take it, Director Alvarez's call did its job." "It did. Sir, we'll need your credentials back, and we're going to need a conversation with this department before we leave." Malcolm stepped out of the cell and looked at Officer Chen, who stood rigid by the filing cabinets, eyes bright. "Officer Chen." "Sir, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. You told the truth in a room that didn't want to hear it." Malcolm said, "That's harder than most people ever have to find out. Don't let this morning convince you it wasn't worth doing." He turned to Halsey, who stood pale near the break room door, the leather wallet still sitting uselessly in his pocket. "You had my credentials in your hand. Officer Halsey, the truth was in your hand, and you chose not to look at it, because looking at it meant admitting you'd already decided who I was before I said a word. That is not a security failure. That is a character failure. And it just cost 211 passengers their morning." Halsey opened his mouth and found, for the first time in 6 years of talking his way through complaints, that he had nothing to say. Chief Roland Dietz arrived at the substation 12 minutes later, having driven from home in record time, and walked into a scene that looked like a federal training exercise. Federal vehicles in his lot, his desk sergeant standing rigid, a man in a captain's uniform being escorted out by an FBI agent, and, frozen against the wall, Grant Halsey, the officer whose impersonator awareness Dietz had personally praised in a staff meeting less than a month earlier. "What in God's name is happening in my substation?" Dietz demanded. Osei turned to face him without hurry. "Chief Dietz, your officer detained a licensed airline captain, disregarded his federal credentials, and caused a material delay to a scheduled international flight. That alone is a serious matter. It has also prompted us to take a closer look at this department's pattern of stops at the employee gates more broadly, starting with the fact that this is not the first complaint involving a minority flight crew member at this airport." Dietz's face went the color of old paper. We've never had a formal complaint. Reach my desk on that. We'll be the judge of whether that's because none occurred, or because none were ever properly logged," Anand said, and there was nothing in her tone suggesting she was joking. "Starting this morning, this incident is under joint review by the FBI and the FAA's Office of Investigations. I'd recommend full cooperation." Chief, because the alternative is considerably worse. Malcolm, walking toward the door flanked by federal agents, paused beside Dietz just long enough to say, in the same level voice he'd used all morning, 211 people missed their connections in London this morning because your officer decided a black man in a captain's uniform was more likely to be an impersonator than an actual captain. I don't say that to embarrass you, Chief. I say it because it's the clearest illustration I can give you of exactly what your department's instincts actually are. When nobody's watching. Malcolm did not have an answer for that either. He simply looked at Dietz for a long moment, letting the silence do what words no longer needed to. Malcolm walked out into the grey pre-dawn light, past the federal vehicles, past agents securing the perimeter of a substation that no longer had any illusions about its own permanence, and did not look back. The review moved with the speed reserved for incidents that could not be allowed to look slow. Within 72 hours, FBI investigators and FAA enforcement officers had pulled 18 months of Harlow County Airport Police, stop records at the employee gates, and found a pattern that was not subtle. A disproportionate share of impersonator awareness stops involved Black and Hispanic flight crew members, ramp workers, and contractors, several of whom had filed informal complaints with their own employers rather than the airport police. Because as more than one of them told investigators, nobody believed a complaint against airport security would go anywhere. Special Agent Anand sat in on the interview when Halsey, stripped of his badge and facing federal charges, was brought in for formal questioning. He was a smaller man in that chair than he had been at the employee gate. You had his credentials in your hand. The FBI investigator across from him said, sliding a photograph of the leather wallet across the table, explain why a 6-year veteran doesn't verify an ATP certificate the second he's holding it. I'd already decided, Halsey said quietly, staring at the table, before I ever got out of the car. Once I'd made the call in my head, nothing was going to change it. Not even the FAA seal in my own pocket. That's the most honest thing you've said all week. The investigator replied, and closed the folder, down the hall. The FAA's Walter Osei spent the same afternoon reconstructing the operational cost of the delay in a report that would later be entered as evidence. Flight 224's 2-hour ground delay had rippled into 3 missed connections in London, forced Meridian to rebook 41 passengers onto later flights, and cost the airline an estimated $340. Zéro pouce compensation. Rebooking fees, and crew duty time violations that triggered a mandatory rest period for the replacement captain, who was ultimately flown out from a different base to cover the trip. People tend to think of this kind of stop as costing one man an hour of dignity, Osei told the courtroom later. In aviation, it costs measurably more than that. And the math is not abstract. It is passengers standing at a gate in another country wondering why their connecting flight left without them. 2 doors down, investigators sat with Desmond Carter, a Meridian Atlantic flight attendant who had been stopped twice at the same employee gate over the previous year, both times for loitering near the crew lounge entrance while waiting for a colleague. Neither stop had ever generated a formal incident report. I figured nobody would believe me over an officer, Carter told them, turning a coffee cup slowly between his hands. The first time he said I fit a description. Second time, there wasn't even a description. He just said, I didn't look like I belonged back there at that hour. I mentioned it to my base manager informally. Nothing ever came of it. And I stopped bringing it up. Because I needed the seniority hours, and I didn't want to be the flight attendant who made trouble with airport security. You're not making trouble now, Mr. Carter, the lead investigator said gently. You're the reason this pattern has a shape, instead of just being one very bad morning for one very unlucky captain. Carter's statement, cross-referenced against Halsey's own body camera archive, which the department had never deleted, apparently never imagining anyone would think to look confirmed, both stops in granular detail vague. Shifting justifications. No actual suspicious activity report from anyone at the airline. And the same prolonged, humiliating pattern of detainment that left no formal paper trail because nothing had technically escalated far enough to require one. Until the morning it escalated against exactly the wrong man, Chief Dietz. Questioned separately about the substation's informal impersonator awareness culture. Insisted the emphasis had come from a genuine security briefing after the previous year's viral incidents, not from any intent to profile an argument that collapsed the moment investigators produced the stop data showing white flight crew members were stopped at a small fraction of the rate of everyone else walking through the exact same employee gate at the exact same hours. Officer Maya Chen was not charged with anything. The U.S. Attorney's Office made a point of publicly distinguishing between officers who had participated in the pattern and the one officer who told the truth the moment federal investigators arrived. She resigned from Harlow County Airport Police within the month and was recruited, on Special Agent Annan's personal recommendation, into the FAA's own Aviation Security Liaison program the following spring work. She told friends that felt like the first thing she'd done on the job that actually mattered, Meridian Atlantic. Facing its own scrutiny for how long it had taken informal crew complaints to surface, launched an internal review of its base security relationships across every airport it served, and quietly ended its long-standing practice of treating employee gate incidents as a purely local law enforcement matter. The Harlow County Airport Authority, facing a public relations crisis just as its transatlantic route expansion was set to launch, held an emergency board session that ran past midnight. Board member Councilwoman Renee Ashford, who had championed the original impersonator awareness security briefing 3 years earlier without ever asking how it would actually be applied at the gate, was the one who finally asked the question none of her colleagues wanted on the record. How many of these stops in the last 18 months actually turned up a real impersonator, versus how many of them were just somebody getting stopped and let go with nothing on paper? When the numbers came back the following week provided under subpoena, since the department itself had never bothered to compile them, the ratio was stark enough that even board members who had wanted to quietly reassign Halsey to a desk instead voted to terminate him outright and open the department's training program to full federal review. Chief Dietz's resignation was on the table before the session adjourned. Sergeant Dale Whitfield, who had processed the booking that morning without ever raising his voice or crossing a line himself, kept his position under the department's new interim leadership, in part because his own instinct, the small, nagging unease that had made him actually read the credential wallet through rather than simply file. It was the only thing in the entire incident report that investigators later pointed to as evidence the old department hadn't been entirely beyond saving. 6 months later, in a federal courtroom, 2 counties over, Grant Halsey stood for sentencing on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law and interference with the operation of a scheduled air carrier. The gallery held reporters, Meridian Atlantic colleagues of Captain Reeves, and, in the second row, Desmond Carter, whose 2 earlier stops buried for over a year in a filing cabinet no one had bothered to look in, had finally been entered into the record as evidence of a pattern rather than dismissed as isolated incidents. The federal prosecutor, a measured woman named Adaize Colton, who had spent a decade building civil rights cases most people never heard about because they rarely escalated into anything as visible as an international flight sitting empty at a gate, stood to address the court before sentencing. Your Honor, the temptation in a case like this is to treat it as an aberration. 1 officer, 1 bad morning, 1 overzealous security briefing, Colton said. But the evidence shows something more durable than that. Mr. Carter was stopped twice, informally, quietly, and told himself it wasn't worth the fight. He was right to believe that, because for 18 months, nothing about how this department operated gave him any reason to believe otherwise. What changed wasn't the officer's judgment. It was the fact that the next person he detained happened to be piloting an aircraft 200 passengers were waiting to board. That is not a system functioning correctly and encountering one bad actor. That is a system that only corrects itself when the person it wrongs happens to have the standing to make it listen. Captain Reeves had submitted a written statement, rather than speak in person, which the prosecutor read into the record at the court's invitation, that the true cost of a single unlawful stop was never contained to the person stopped, that it radiated outward into every colleague who had quietly absorbed a smaller version of the same humiliation and decided it wasn't worth reporting, and that real accountability meant asking not what happened to the officer who made the stop, but whether the institution around him had been built in a way that made the stop almost inevitable. The federal judge did not need long to reach her sentence. You held the truth in your own hand. Mr. Halsey, she said, looking down from the bench, and you chose not to look at it, because looking at it meant admitting you were wrong about a man before he'd said a word. That choice did not just end your career. It exposed a department that had been quietly tolerating a pattern of stops against minority flight crew for years, until one of those officers happened to detain the wrong man on the wrong morning, and he had the standing to make sure it was finally looked at. I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison. Halsey did not look back at the gallery as marshals led him out, on a clear morning, the following autumn. 14 months after he had sat in a holding cell with his wrists bruised and his credentials sitting uselessly in another man's pocket. Captain Malcolm Reeves walked through the employee gate at Harlow County International at the start of another early shift. Flight case rolling behind him. Uniform pressed. 4 gold stripes, catching the morning light. The gate had new lighting now. Brighter. Fewer shadows along the fence line. And a young officer he didn't recognize nodded to him from the guard booth. Morning. Captain. Good flight ahead, should be a clean one. Thank you. He walked the familiar path toward the crew lounge, unhurried, and paused for a moment at the door. Looking back at the terminal, lit against the dawn sky, the same airport. The same gate. But a version of it now that had been forced, in the end, to become something closer to what it had always claimed to be. He thought, not with anger, which had never done him any good at 35,000 feet or anywhere else, but with the same clear-eyed precision he brought to every checklist about how close the whole quiet machinery of that briefing culture had come to grinding on indefinitely, simply because no one with the standing to be believed had ever been made to stand in a holding cell and prove it. He thought, too, about Desmond Carter, who had transferred his base assignment the following spring to an airport in a different region entirely. In a move he'd told Malcolm over coffee in the crew, lounge was less about escaping anything and more about starting somewhere that didn't already have a story attached to his name. Malcolm had written him a letter of recommendation, longer than the transfer technically required, because some debts were not the kind that closed out cleanly on their own timeline, and because he understood, better than most people ever would, that the quiet cost of being disbelieved twice and staying silent was not something a policy change alone could repair. He thought, briefly, about Officer Chen, who had sent him a short message the week the FAA program hired her, thanking him for the recommendation he hadn't even known. She'd asked Agent Anand to request on her behalf. He'd written back a single line, "You did the harder thing when it counted. That's the whole job." He hadn't expected a reply, and none had come, which felt, in its own quiet way, like exactly the right ending to that particular thread. He badged into the crew lounge, set his flight case down, and began his pre-flight briefing, in no hurry at all. If a story like this reminds you why accountability matters, hit that like button. Share it with someone who believes nobody should be judged by the color of their skin instead of the uniform on their back. And subscribe for more true-to-life stories of justice finally catching up. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Captain Reeves's position?